I'm Kristin Leonheart, and I'm a psychotherapist and spiritual teacher and healer in North Carolina. And my approach to healing exists at the nexus of trauma and somatic work, intuitive healing movement, soul work, and the enlightenment path. My life has really revolved around the question of how we heal. I'm interested in promoting healing on the deepest possible level. I'm a person who wants to do the things that I do all the way. And that attitude got me into a bit of trouble on my own spiritual journey. So let me share a bit of my own story to share how I came to my approach and what it is that I offer. So I went full on into my own healing process, initially with internal family systems or parts work, then with Vipassana practice and a very intensive rhythm of meditation retreats. Like I did a year's worth of retreats in 5 years. So like 20% of my time in that period was spent on retreat. And after some years of exciting progress in what I often call a honeymoon period, I encountered my own spiritual emergency, accompanied by a health emergency. And while I was very stubborn about it, I eventually accepted that I would have to radically reevaluate my approach to my own path and to my work. Specifically, I realized I would have to face my own spiritual bypassing and repressed trauma. And at that time, there was no one who understood the intersection of trauma and spiritual emergency in the enlightenment path, other than some of the people I was walking alongside who were experiencing similar things. And so we needed to create a new understanding for ourselves, a new paradigm for spiritual support in the modern era, one that took in and addressed the fullness of our humanity and the typical challenges people face today, while staying grounded in the ancient wisdom spiritual teachers of times past gifted to us. So I came to understand how devoting myself to a very ultimate perspective and path, and by ultimate perspective, I mean the perspective Eastern teachings point to of unity, no self, compassion for all, etc. And, you could say much more about that, but that'll suffice for understanding what I mean. So I came to understand that what I was actually doing was recreating my trauma history, actually amplifying my biggest weaknesses with my practice. And so at that point, I devoted myself instead to understanding how the wounded nervous system interacts with meditation, retreat, and the ultimate perspective, and what supports and alterations people can need to be able to most effectively benefit from these practices and teachings. So I developed my own system through training in somatic experiencing, organic intelligence, and other trauma resolution modalities alongside my best friend and colleague, Francesca Morfesis, for how to address trauma and spiritual emergency while still supporting someone's desire to lead a spiritual life. For me, my own spiritual awakening process only began and was only able to unfold after really leaving behind ultimate teachings and devoting myself to ego and trauma work. And that's not necessary for everyone, but it taught me that these things are not mutually exclusive and in fact are quite interdependent. I understand now that healing and awakening only occur if everything gets included, inside and outside of our own bodies. Spiritual bypassing will never work. The relative or human perspective and experience can't be devalued or discarded. It's not bad and it's not unreal. You may have heard before, we must have a self before we can lose a self. But I would add, we must be embodied before we can transcend the body. We must be empowered and have agency before we can relinquish control through a surrender process. We must value and have compassion for ourselves before we can offer that in a genuine way to others, and so on. And you can actually do that with basically every ultimate teaching. You can find a relative capacity that we have to own or have online before we can give it up, at least before we can give it up healthily or effectively. And I found that awakening isn't simply a transcendent state where there are no boundaries and there's only bliss and peace. It's actually, for me, in the meeting of my relative and human wisdom, held in a constant background, sometimes in the foreground, but often in the background, this broader perspective of peace, of the awakened ground, that I move and act more and more. And there's still pain and anger and grief, hatred and joy and love and freedom. There's all the things. There's just less conflict and less of a sense of a barrier between these two seemingly paradoxical perspectives. It's an integration and an incorporation more than it is a separation. One's not being eliminated. And so it's through this respect for both aspects of being that I work, and that I find healing is facilitated most efficiently and with the least suffering. So let me share more about what I work with and how I work. I rely primarily on the modalities of parts work, specifically internal family systems, and trauma resolution modalities such as somatic experiencing and organic intelligence for working with the ego. And these modalities help facilitate organization of the experience of the psyche, creating coherence out of chaos, confusion, or disconnection. They bring online compassion and understanding to various aspects of our experiences. They help us to disinhibit and release stuck energy and emotion, help us to process old traumas, and they help people re-own disowned power. And it's worth flagging, this is a big focus of my work. Everyone who comes to see me at this time has needed support with re-empowerment. And that's a very short summary, but it hits some of the most important points. So I also have a strong background in attachment theory, having trained in a marriage and family therapy program. A majority of my clients have chronic illnesses, as I do myself. So I've developed expertise in understanding how the psyche and body interact and how to affect both when that's possible. In terms of my own spiritual background, I've spent the most time practicing within Theravadan Buddhism, non-duality, paganism, and I would add intuitive movement, even though that's not an explicitly spiritual practice. And while it's more than just a spiritual practice for me, it is a spiritual practice. And it has been an important one. I was also raised Christian, and while that's not my orientation anymore, I have a deep love for what Jesus taught, so that aspect of my history still informs who I am. I identified as Buddhist for some years, but my awakening process stripped that away. So I don't identify with any label for my spirituality now, and I'm certainly not religious. But to an outsider, I probably talk most like a quirky, woke Buddhist or non-dual practitioner. In addition to being limited by the ultimate perspective in this period of my life, I also found the spiritual teachings I was immersed in to have a significant masculine bias, as well as a white one, not in their origination, of course, when it comes to whiteness, but in the way that they were being translated and taught to me. And so this, along the fact that it was 2016 or so, and, this is what we were doing back then, it led me to become very aware of my own whiteness and to see how I had internalized that along with patriarchy, fatphobia, and so on, and to start the deconstruction process around that. And I sought out feminine and indigenous approaches to spirituality and used practices like intuitive movement, usually ecstatic dance, to in part heal the inhibition, isolation, and loss of sensuality and playfulness that is so typical in our culture. And that was incredibly beneficial to me and informs my work to this day. Just as an aside, just to be clear, I don't demonize masculinity. A healthy masculinity is a necessary and beautiful aspect of our humanity, regardless of our gender. But I needed to dismantle a lot of toxic masculinity and femininity within myself to find what is a natural and healthy balance for me. So in terms of spiritual emergency, I realize it takes on many forms. So I'll go through what I typically work with. I work with Kundalini or other energy imbalances, and Kundalini awakening is one of the ways that my own spiritual emergency manifested. So I know it intimately. Kundalini is often an incredibly brutal journey. I won't minimize that. but those who go through it almost always look back on it with gratitude for how it changes us. Although I will say, if you're at the beginning of your journey and that sounds ridiculous, I don't blame you a single bit. I felt the exact same way when I was just starting out. I also work with extreme dissociation, such as depersonalization and derealization, or DPDR. DPDR isn't always exactly what it seems when it comes to spirituality. It's often how a person with a trauma history presents when they encounter a state of awakening, when they have a predisposition to dissociation as a way to respond to stress or vulnerability, which awakening always raises, at least as we're adjusting to it. Fortunately, the genuine state of awakening is usually still present and can become a resource as the trauma that is causing the rigidity and discomfort with the state is processed. And that's, again, not to minimize how upsetting and persistent DPDR can be. I certainly understand that. It's just to offer a reflection of what's possible that isn't usually named when it comes to this. It's common for people also to encounter a dark night of the soul on the spiritual path, and these can be massively transformative portals of awakening, as long as we have the support we need to be able to allow the intensity of the letting go process. That's what the dark night is asking of us, to let go of a foundational way that we relate to life, to ourselves. And beyond these specifics, a spiritual emergency can also just look like overwhelm and significant nervous system dysregulation, the reemergence of repressed trauma, or a significantly distressing reaction to a meditative state or teaching. And these are all common things that I address in my practice. I should say psychosis is not an area of expertise for me. I know it's common for people to experience with spiritual emergency, but it's not something I commonly work with. But I do work with abuse survivors and with people who've experienced spiritual abuse from a teacher, a cult, a romantic partner, a friend, parent, or other loved one. And I'll just take a moment here to say that not abusing my own power and my role is something I'm deeply committed to as a healer. And let me go ahead and be clear that with all the healing that I've done, and even with being in an awakening process, and with the intent of that awakening process being not to cause harm, to cause less harm, less and less, that I have ego and that I can act out of that, and that no person, no matter how far along they are in their process, is immune to making mistakes or to acting out of woundedness to hurt another individual. So don't ever give your power away to any spiritual teacher or healer or therapist. And don't be gaslit by someone who claims they aren't capable of causing you harm or acting out of a wounded place, because that's bullshit, always, 100% of the time. So if you are trying to heal from spiritual abuse, I'd love to help walk you through that process. And as of this recording in 2026, I am training in shamanic journeying and refining my abilities to facilitate soul retrieval, to support past life memory retrieval and healing, and to support people who need help with spiritual gifts such as psychic abilities and mediumship. None of these experiences started with these labels for me. I didn't go looking for past life memories, for example. I had experiences and I had to find words for them. And the words that I'm using are the best ones that I could find, though they feel pretty inadequate. And if you've had these experiences, you might find that you have felt the same way. I didn't at all expect for my path to veer into this territory. It's the most recent turn that my path has taken. Actually, at 14, I decided that I was an atheist, and I was a materialist and agnostic / atheist until my mid to late 20s. That's when things started to shift for me. I didn't believe in anything science couldn't measure in that period. And it feels important for me to say that my deep respect for science remains with me today. That's been a constancy. I find it fascinating. I love to learn. I love to, see, what science is discovering all the time. I just began to have experiences that science hasn't yet figured out how to measure, and I had no choice but to reckon with that. I didn't ask for or seek these experiences, but they came. But I still value the scientific method, and I approach my experiences with a mind dedicated to seeking the truth, always over my own preferences. And when I have a new experience, I don't jump to conclusions. I watch it for months and sometimes years. I watch how my mind influences or interacts with it to make sure I'm observing pure phenomena. I can see this happens, then that happens, then that happens, then that happens. And I make sure what I'm seeing is not phenomena that's created by my ego or affected by my ego to a great extent. And only after these long periods of observation, when I feel very, very clear, do I speak with an appropriate amount of confidence about what I'm experiencing. So, while I've become quite maximum woo in many regards, I'm still at heart a very practical person who is committed to staying grounded and not becoming deluded or ungrounded amidst the strange and unquantifiable. So I was generally taught that cities or spiritual gifts are cul-de-sacs on the enlightenment path. And of course, I would agree that they can certainly get us into trouble. They aren't enlightenment, and we have to remember that. But that being said, I found through my own journey that they're just another aspect of reality. And reality in all its forms is what enlightenment asks us to reckon with. And I've been more resourced by them than I ever imagined was possible. So healing on a soul level, I now see as an important part of the journey. And so that's now part of what I offer as well. In explaining this to this degree, I'm hoping to avoid some of you sciencey people reflexively saying, oh, this girl is not for me, because I love my sciencey people, my well-educated people, my, people who only believe in the material world. I love those people because again, I was one of those people, and that's part of me is still an important part of who I am. I don't want sciencey people to stop coming to me because they don't believe in these kinds of things. And anyways, I work with people where they're at. With many of my clients, we don't discuss these things or work explicitly on a soul level at all, or not for many years. Okay, so in terms of my personality and manner as a therapist, I would say that I am direct, I'm open, I'm flexible in terms of the way that I think, and I'm able to, shift between perspectives based on what someone needs. I'm caring, I'm very curious, and I love to bring humor into my sessions when I can. Most people experience me as intense. I want to get to the heart of things, and I see through psychological defenses naturally. I respect people's pacing and needs, but it's still worth saying if you're looking for a therapist with a lot of light feminine energy, that's not really my thing. So, okay. So I want to get to the heart of what it is that I do and what it is that I believe, which I've been trying to explain the little pieces of it, but I want to put it together. So I know in my bones that each person has the capacity to heal fully and has the capacity for enlightenment. That's our true nature. Beneath all these words, the modalities, the training, this is the essence of what I have apprenticed myself to. How do I tap into the wisdom of each person's system to open up the healing movements that are just waiting to unfold? They're just waiting for someone to unblock them. And how do I find those blocks and then find what they need to be able to relax? That's what I do at its core. And I want to teach you to be able to access and rely on this wisdom for yourself. So you don't need me. So I'll end with saying that I know what it's like to be brought to your knees by life. I know what it's like to despair, that life could be anything other than deep pain and misery. My path has taken me there. And people told me it would get better. The healers I saw, people in my life, and mostly I thought they were ridiculous. But they were right. And I'm so glad that I somehow kept putting one foot in front of the other, even when it seemed impossible to do so. Living an integrated life to me means feeling a deep sense of trust, even without knowing that things will work out okay. It means knowing and welcoming all parts of yourself with a deep love. It means abiding in the field of peace that connects all things and allowing that field to meet our experience in times of both joy and difficulty. It means owning every scrap of agency we have and not being afraid to use it, and at the same time, not grasping for control that we don't have. It means letting each moment unfold as a mystery, as a question you're always asking of the moment and answering intuitively. Okay, I think that's my spiel. There's so much more detail on my website if you're still curious. I've gone into detail about my own journey on my About Me page. I offer free resources on my resources page. You can find free talks on my other site, Full Circle Spirituality, and you'll find more detail about my approach throughout my website. If you weren't aware by now, I'm very thorough. Limiting myself to this very long intro video was extremely difficult. I don't like it. If you'd like to schedule a session or a free 15-minute consultation, reach out. My greatest joy, truly, is in offering people access to their whole authentic selves, a deep and abiding self-compassion and compassion for the world, and an immersion and fluid movement from the truest ground within our experience. Thanks for listening.